Hello, everyone. Welcome to our today's lecture on population aging, ageism, and intergenerational relations. Let's begin with a few personal questions. Have you ever laughed at a joke about older people and sex? Or thought someone was too old to wear something trendy or act a certain way? Ever found yourself behind a slow driver and muttered, "Come on, Grandpa"? If so, you're not alone. These are everyday, casual examples of ageism. They might seem harmless and even funny, but they reflect deeper biases about aging. Sometimes ageism shows up in ways that are meant to be kind or complimentary, like saying, "You look great for your age," or joking in a birthday card about someone being ancient, or telling someone with a sore back, "Well, that's just part of getting older." Even though these comments may come from a good place, they still carry the message that aging is a decline, something negative or unfortunate. So, today's lecture invites you to really think about that. How even small, seemingly harmless things can reflect and reinforce ageism. We're going to look at aging not just as a personal process, but as something shaped by social and cultural forces. That includes everything from population changes to how our economic systems work to the kinds of stories society tells about growing older. To get us started, let's look at the numbers. What does aging actually look like in demographic terms? And how has this led to one especially powerful and misleading narrative? The idea that population aging is a crisis. Now that we have introduced the idea that aging is shaped by society, let's talk about what's actually happening demographically. In Canada or other industrialized countries, it's no secret populations are aging. Back in 2011, about 14.4% of Canadians were over the age of 65, and that number has kept rising. But aging isn't happening at the same pace everywhere. Some parts of Canada, like Nunavut or northern Manitoba, have younger populations, mainly due to higher birth rates and lower life expectancies, particularly among indigenous communities. Globally, the same pattern shows up. In poorer countries where people tend to have more children and live shorter lives, there are fewer older adults. From a sociological point of view, what's driving these changes? A big part of the story is what's called the demographic transition. As countries industrialize, both birth and death rates drop. This shift is connected to all kinds of social changes: urbanization, new work and family patterns, better access to birth control, education, especially for women, and the rising cost of raising children. And then there is the baby boom. After World War II, there was a massive spike in births. Those babies born between 1946 and the early 60s are now reaching older adulthood, which has dramatically shaped Canada's age profile. But it's not just about fewer kids, it's also about people living longer. Thanks to improvements in healthcare, public health, and living conditions, life expectancy has gone up. This is called the epidemiological transition, where causes of death shift from infectious diseases to chronic conditions. So, more people are living into old age, and that's a good thing. Still, how we talk about these numbers matters. Take the dependency ratio, for example. This compares the number of older adults to the working age population and is often used to suggest that seniors are a burden. But that's a pretty narrow and misleading way to look at things. Lots of older adults keep working, provide childcare. They volunteer and don't rely on public support the way these models assume. So while demographic tools like dependency ratios and population pyramids can be useful, we need to interpret them critically. Otherwise, we risk buying into fear-based narratives that exaggerate the challenges of aging, and that's exactly what we are going to unpack next. Now that we've covered the numbers, let's talk about how those numbers are interpreted. One of the most powerful and problematic interpretations is what's known as apocalyptic demography. This is the tendency, especially in media and politics, to treat population aging like a looming disaster. You've probably heard it. Older people are portrayed as a threat to healthcare systems, pension plans, and economic stability. This kind of alarmism shows up in headlines, government reports, and even casual conversations. One study found that nearly two-thirds of articles in a major international magazine framed older adults as a burden. But here is the thing, these stories ignore the bigger picture. Population aging is actually the result of positive developments, like longer life expectancy and improved living conditions. It's a sign of success, not failure. And many of the panic-inducing claims just don't hold up. For example, when you account for shifts in the population, the overall dependency burden is still lower than it was during the baby boom. Healthcare costs linked to aging are relatively modest, and pension programs like Old Age Security and the Canada Pension Plan have been found to be financially stable. So, why do these fear-based stories persist? Because they serve a purpose. They can be used to justify cuts to public programs by framing them as economically necessary rather than politically chosen. They shift blame away from policy decisions and onto older people themselves. And they have real consequences. They reinforce stereotypes. They lump all older adults together. They create intergenerational resentment. And perhaps most troubling, they make people think that issues like long hospital wait times are just part of getting older, when really they're tied to choices our governments make. The bottom line is aging brings challenges, sure, but it's not a catastrophe. We need to stay critical of narratives that exaggerate the downsides and ignore the social systems that actually shape these experiences. So now let's dig deeper into the concept of ageism. At its core, ageism means stereotyping or discriminating against someone just because of their age. It has two main parts: attitudes, what people think about older adults, and behaviors, how those thoughts turn into actions or treatment. And while we often think of ageism as something that only affects older people, it can impact younger folks too. For example, being told you're too young to lead or not being taken seriously because of your age. One of the most common ways ageism shows up is through othering. That's when we treat older adults as if they're a separate category of people, different from the rest of us. We flatten out their individuality and ignore how diverse older adults actually are. Most studies have focused on people's attitudes towards aging, but those attitudes don't just appear out of nowhere. They come from broader cultural messages and stereotypes. Some are obviously negative, like seeing older adults as forgetful or slow. But even the so called positive stereotypes can be problematic. Calling an older couple cute or saying someone is young at heart can sound sweet, but they subtly frame older adults as childlike or less capable. Even well meaning professionals working in care settings can fall into this trap. For example, thinking they're better off after death may help someone cope with loss, but it also reinforces the idea that old age equals suffering. These attitudes matter because they influence how older adults are treated. That includes being ignored, patronized, denied services, or having their health concerns brushed off. In fact, a lot of older adults say they've experienced unfair treatment simply because of their age. And ageism isn't just about individuals being biased. It's built into our institutions. Think about retirement policies that force people out of work at a certain age, or healthcare systems that assume older bodies aren't worth investing in. These are examples of institutionalized ageism. And there's another layer: internalized ageism. That's when older adults start to absorb these negative messages and believe them. This can lead to lower self esteem, less political involvement, or even distancing themselves from anything associated with being old. From a sociological perspective, this reflects a process called labeling. When people are repeatedly told that aging is bad, it shapes how they see themselves and what they think they are capable of. So, ageism isn't just out there in the world, it gets under our skin. And changing it means more than changing minds, it means changing systems and shifting the culture around aging. Now that we have defined ageism and seen how it works, let's ask a question. Where does it come from? One theory from psychology suggests it has to do with our fear of death. Older people remind us of our own mortality, and that can be uncomfortable. But more commonly, social psychological theories point to how we learn ageism. Through families, schools, media, essentially through our whole socialization process. We pick up negative attitudes about aging. Think about the kinds of message we get from movies, the TV, social media. Older characters are often the, the topic of jokes, shown as helpless or out of touch. Ads sell us anti-aging creams by making aging seem like a disease. Even political rhetoric talks about seniors as a burden. Culturally, we place a lot of value on youth, beauty, independence, and productivity. That leaves little space for the reality of later life, which is often more complex. Now, some people argue that other cultures treat aging differently, and there's some truth to that. In traditional Chinese culture, for example, there is a strong emphasis on respecting elders. Some indigenous communities hold elders in high spiritual regard. But it's not as simple as saying those cultures do it better. Respect is often tied to roles or status, not just age. And even in those contexts, ageism can still happen. Also, let's not romanticize the past. Just because families used to live together doesn't mean those relationships were always positive. Living together doesn't automatically mean closeness or respect. So, how do we challenge ageism? Social learning theory says we need better models, more positive representations of older adults. Media can help here, especially if it shows older people as active, complex, and diverse. But we need to be careful not to swing too far the other way. If the only image of successful aging is the marathon running 80-year-old, we risk excluding people who are aging differently. That's called positive ageism, and it's just another way of setting unrealistic standards. Another powerful strategy is to encourage real interaction across age groups. When younger people actually get to know older adults, it reduces fear and breaks down stereotypes. But our society is very age segregated. We work, live, and socialize in age based spaces, and that fuels misunderstanding. So, reducing ageism means more than changing how we think. It means changing how we live, interact, and build our institutions. Now let's turn to some bigger picture sociological theories. One of the earliest ideas that tried to explain ageism is called modernization theory. This theory argues that as societies industrialized, the social status of older adults declined. Here is how that works. As new technologies and industries developed, younger workers became more valuable because they had the latest skills. Older adults, whose knowledge and experience were based on pre-industrial life, were seen as less relevant. Education systems began focusing on preparing the young for modern jobs, and retirement became a formalized way to make space for them in the workforce. At the same time, urbanization pulled families apart geographically. So instead of living with extended family, older adults were often left isolated or on the margins of family life. In other words, modernization disrupted the traditional roles and supported systems that older adults used to rely on. and that shift contributed to more negative attitudes about aging. Now, this theory isn't perfect. It assumes that older adults were universally respected in traditional societies, which isn't always true. And it doesn't fully explain why some modern societies still maintain strong roles for elders. That said, it's useful because it shows how big social changes, not just personal biases, can shape how we view and treat older people. Today, we're not just living in an industrial society. We have moved into what many call a post industrial or postmodern society, where there is more personal choice and a wider range of life experiences. Some sociologists are hopeful about this, suggesting that aging could become more diverse, individualized, and empowering. But others argue we have hit a kind of a snag. Even though people are living longer and staying active much later in life, our institutions, things like work, healthcare, and public policy, haven't kept up. They still operate on old assumptions about aging. This gap is what sociologists call structural lag. Structural lag means society hasn't adjusted to the new realities of aging. For example, we might have older adults who want to keep working, but workplaces that won't hire them, or healthcare systems that assume older patients aren't worth investing in. So, even though people's ability and aspirations have changed, the structures around them haven't. That's why rethinking aging means rethinking the design of our social systems, from retirement policy to healthcare access to urban planning. Building on that, let's look at how critical gerontology takes things even further. This approach asks not just how social change affects aging, but who benefits and who loses in the current setup. From a critical perspective, ageism isn't just an unintended consequence of modernization. It's actively produced and reinforced by our economic and political systems, especially under capitalism and neoliberalism. For example, mandatory retirement policies didn't just happen because people got old. They were also about cost. Older workers are often more expensive, higher wages, more benefits, and employers may push them out not because they can't do the job, but because they challenge unfair labor practices or demand better protections. Critical gerontologists argue that ageism helps support the bottom line for certain institutions and industries. It helps justify removing older workers, cutting pensions, or scaling back healthcare, all in the name of economic efficiency. This approach also points out that older adults often internalize these messages. They might blame themselves for being too slow or behind the times instead of recognizing that the system is set up in ways that disadvantage them. So, the takeaway here is that ageism isn't just about attitudes, it's about power. It's about which groups get to define value, set the rules, and control resources. To fight ageism from this angle, we need systemic change. reforms that address not just age, but also how age interacts with class, race, gender, and ability. This brings us to two really important concepts in sociology: age relations and age stratification. When we talk about age relations, we are looking at how age structures power and opportunity. Just like gender or race, age is a social category that organizes who gets what, who is listened to, and who holds influence. And these dynamics intersect with other systems of inequality. So, for example, being an older woman or an older racialized person can compound marginalization. Age stratification theory builds on this by explaining how different age groups have different levels of access to resources. Older adults often have less economic power, less political voice, and are underrepresented in cultural life. That's not because of biology, it's because of how society is organized. So instead of thinking of ageism as just a bunch of negative beliefs, this perspective shows that ageism is woven into the fabric of society. It's about systems and structures. And that understanding gives us a clear path for change. Finally, let's turn to how generations interact both in families and in society at large. A lot of research on intergenerational relations focuses on families. How do adult children support aging parents? How do these relationships balance care, affection, and conflict? One myth we'll return to later in the course is the idea that families used to care better for their elders. While it's true that families often lived together more in the past, that doesn't necessarily mean those relationships were emotionally closer. Often, co-residence was driven by economic necessity, not love or respect. Even today, families are still the main source of support for older adults, providing care, help with housing, and emotional connection. But sociologists also look beyond families to the larger picture. Generational identities matter. People born around the same time, what we call cohorts, often share life experiences that shape their values. This can lead to misunderstandings. For instance, older generations might value thrift because they lived through economic hardships, while younger ones might see that as being cheap. Or young people might see older adults' views as too traditional or resistant to social change. But having good family relationships doesn't always mean better intergenerational understanding across society. That's because we also have structural age segregation. Think about it. Schools are for young people. Workplaces are often youth focused. Retirement communities isolate older adults. Even cultural products, music, social media, TV, are often aimed at just one age group. All of this reduces chances for meaningful interaction between generations. And when we don't interact, stereotypes fill the gap. On the flip side, strong family ties and supportive public programs can actually reduce this divide. When older adults receive pensions or health care, they often use these resources to support their kids and grandkids, whether that's through childcare, financial help, or just being emotionally available. So, the idea that supporting older people hurts younger ones doesn't just hold up. These supports can actually benefit everyone in society. In closing, population aging doesn't have to lead to generational conflict. If we recognize our interdependence, it can actually be a moment to build stronger connections and solidarity. Ageism, like any form of inequality, is socially constructed, and that means it can be dismantled too.